make them necessarily rivals, but that really creates the societal ideational infrastructure that puts them potentially on the path, to rivalry. So what are some of really similar dynamics that drive rivalry in the case of Algeria and Morocco, for example? How do the perceptions of decision makers matter? So we are also interested in the fact that since such really phenomena persist over long periods of time, they create some inertia, meaning a lot of times many rivalries persist, and if you do a lot of interviews with decision makers, asking them why do you engage in this acrimony with the others, there's not really a rational or a logical answer. They might really reference, well, it's been this way for decades, and then there's inertia locked in this really relationship. And given that really dynamic, and given the fact that over time those hostile relationships change, right? They feed off other really dynamics, the interventions of major powers, regional really conflicts and wars. We are interested in how shocks change the dynamics of interstate rivalries. And in particular, we are interested in theorizing shocks. Shocks are not really given a lot of attention in the literature. We think they should. And we do in this project, and I'll show you some examples of how they're really important. And what are some of the examples of the shocks? So some of the shocks might include wars, which might be sort of intuitive, that if there's a conflict really nearby, states are shocked into trying to deal with it. An internal revolt, such as what happened in 2010 in the MENA, the coming of a president with a certain personality changes the dynamic, and I'm hinting at Trump here. Or maybe sometimes states fear peace. So the feeling that they might be leading towards peace might move some actors within states to rise up really the level of tension, meaning to move away from peace. That is a shock in and of itself. So we sought out to theorize shocks as important factors driving rivalries, and this is what we did. So why is it really, what's so really special about rivalry analysis then, if we are focusing on this very specific really phenomenon? Rivalry analysis, contrary to a lot of assumptions in international relations and in study of conflict that do assume that states tend to act in similar ways, in analysis of rivalries, we actually start from the understanding that states will not behave in a certain way, and they will not really behave in similar ways. So we sort of start with an assumption of uncertainty. And then we want to understand what are the characteristics then of states that make them particularly prone to conflict. What are the contextual factors that make them also prone to conflict? So we want to know what are the specificities of the cases, and can we then, after understanding them really deeply, make generalizations about the behavior of states. And this is really the importance of the study of rivalry. We want to understand what other factors become important in the dynamic of rivalry. So for example, is regional hegemony or dominance or hierarchy important? We think it is. In the case of the Middle East and North Africa, there is no regional dominant really power. And we believe that is a factor that contributes to the persistence of rivalries, in the sense that a hegemon or a dominant really power is understood to lay foundations of certain forms of relations within regions, either in the security realm or in the economic realm. So in the absence, for example, of interconnectedness in trade, how does that help sustain rivalries? How does that help rivalries morph? Now, as you can see, there's an interaction effect here happening, right? The outbreak or the onset of rivalries shapes the regional order, and that feeds back into the dynamic of rivalry. So this really dynamism in studying international relations is really a basic feature of the study of rivalry. This is why we are very close to our brothers and sisters and others who study or who are in history and in also sociology, because we do appreciate this longue durée approach to understanding the world, and we want to bring that to the study of conflict and to the study of interstate relations. What is it about shocks that's important? As I mentioned, then shocks become extremely important because they change the inertia, and they become in and of themselves dynamic of change within the rivalry, as you will hear really in a minute in the presentation. So why was the MENA interesting? Now, for a region that's been so prone to conflict, militarized and non-really militarized hostile interactions, ours was the first book explicitly on rivalries. It came out 2 years or a year and a half, last year actually. And we found that really to be fascinating, meaning there's a lot of people that talk about rivalry, there's a lot of people that describe what's happening, but that systematic approach to studying the region was missing. So we thought we needed to make an intervention. We needed really to not only try to understand how the region works. We wanted also to make a claim about how can we compare the region to global others. And the first move to do that, the first move to make an argument as to why there's no Middle East exceptionalism, is to try to understand the patterns of conflict and then try to see how those relate or compare to others really globally. And we do that in the work that we really produced. Now, my personal really motivation, other than being really working on issues of conflict and international relations, I wanted also to understand, again, not only how to compare the patterns in interstate relations in the MENA to others really globally. I wanted to try to look for a frame that looks at the MENA from not from the prism of sectarianism that often is used. This is really dated. I believe it's not really genuinely interesting anymore. We need something other than the persistent use of sectarianism to analyze MENA international relations. Shiite versus Sunni, this versus that. And rivalry allows us to interrogate a wide range of factors at play, right? Including, perhaps, but not necessarily focusing on sectarianism. So what did we find, right? If we looked at the MENA, again, as I'm making the claim that it's a study that's inclined to look at history, what did we find? And what were the factors that we think are really important? Again, I'm here advocating for the shocks and rivalries, so this is what we found. I don't know if can I make this more? How do I? This is F. So, for some reason, okay. So, okay.
Which slide can I?
No, up.
How? Which slide?
Up. Yeah.
This one?
Yep. Excellent. So, if you look at the region in 1975, and again, I'm really stealing this from my co-author and my partner in crime, William R. Thompson, who couldn't be really with us. This is from his chapter. In 1975, we do observe certain patterns of interstate really rivalries. We had basically a lot of conflict really spread out, if you want. This is still, anyway, I don't know if you can see with the audience, but we can see it really clearly. Algeria and Morocco had major powers involved. We had Iraq at the center of some rivalries, as well as Syria. I mean, obviously, the power really dynamics or the distribution of capabilities was very varied. But again, a distribution of capabilities does not preclude rivalry, meaning also small states can rival with really bigger states. And then we move to the rivalry field in 2000, and it has changed. If you really look at it, I don't know if you can see it. This is somewhat really regrettable because this was a very fancy slide. Iran is at the center of regional rivalries. So the field really changes to have Iran picking a set of rivalries with a whole bunch of other states, with Israel, with Saudi Arabia, with Iraq, with the United States. And my colleague would also claim with Egypt. Now, this is really fascinating in the sense that it became the center of attention of rivalries in the region. And a lot of other really rivalries hadn't died out yet. They were still very active. So what we did was we asked our really participants. There's a very really general understanding of rivalry that we have. You know the cases in the region. What can you tell us about the cases that you know? And in particular, what can you tell us about this change that happened in the region? How can we understand it? What can really help us explain it? And we came up, or they help us. People cannot see this. It's a very nice slide. Good. So anyway, so what we did was we relied on an empirically driven analysis, which is really the fascinating thing about the study of rivalries. So to look at the important shocks that happened in the cases, so in Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Israel, the onset of the Egypt really rivalry with Saudi Arabia in the 50s and the 60s, Israel and Syria, Israel, Egypt, again, Iran, Saudi Arabia was very important, and we saw that there is a very important set of shocks that recurred throughout the cases. That it seems that the region was really visibly jarred by a set of really shocks that happened, and the most important of which really started in 1975 with the revolution in Iran. Now the question then would be, why is that important for the region? What happened there that...
Full screen, no? Yeah, it's full screen.
Okay, so that you don't interrupt him, just keep going and then try to
Okay.
come there, yeah?
Okay, so this... There's a missing slide. It's the one before. Wait.
Go back.
Well, go down. Could you go up?
Okay, you share from here, you control from here. Okay, you control it from here. Okay. Now we share it.
Okay,
Okay.
all right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, now which slide? This one?
No, one down.
Down?
Down.
This one?
Yes.
Okay. So, okay.
Okay,
So-
yeah,
so-
keep going.
Okay.
Just
So-
don't interrupt.
So our empirically really driven analysis was really fascinating in the sense that we didn't prod anybody to do any change or to intentionally look at the shocks that were very really responsible in the cases. Look at what happens after 1975. we see here the revolution in Iran was really dominant across the cases. Look, and it really appears in almost all of them. Actually, it does appear in all of them. So that was a turning point in the international relations of the region. But then we persist in really looking at the importance of the end of the Cold War as an important really factor, the invasion of Iraq in 2003 as an important really factor, and the Arab Spring also appears in all the cases as a very important factor. So we do know now, we have a very strong sense of how to think of shocks in the Middle East and North Africa. And this really sets the foundation of our new work that will look at really that will really interrogate these really dynamics in the region. So the empirical really driven analysis was very informative, and we do think that those four events, so the revolution in 1979, the end of the Cold War, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and then the 2010-2011 revolts, were not only responsible for a lot of change in domestic politics in the region, they also defined the international relations of the MENA, and in particular, they defined the set of rivalries in the MENA. Now, what's so really special about the Middle East in our analysis? The Middle East is really special in the sense that it's not very special. In the sense that it has a colonial really background where a lot of the state really borders were created under short periods of time. A lot of other states around the world had hundreds of years to kill each other and ethnic cleanse and go through the motions of living and not wanting to live with each other, and thus really specified the terrain of the states. That was not the case in the MENA. Hence, this really creates another layer of pressure on the states, thus also being a motivator for rivalry. We do see that the lack of hierarchy is also important. Hierarchy sets, as I said, helps really set the contours of the region. We see the intervention by the United States as very important in igniting a lot of the rivalries, and curiously, in allowing a lot of the small states act as rivals. So a lot of small states in the region are able to act in ways that otherwise they might not have been able to had it not been for the intervention and the support of the United States. So that really creates a permissive really condition for rivaling. All this really is to say that the factors interact, but it does not make the MENA any more strange to comparative regional analysis and to comparative really global analysis. So in the end, what are some of the recommendations that we had for the field? And really, maybe specifically, these are some of the recommendations for our students in the program and for other really researchers. One is the clear really statement that's not really smart, which is the MENA is complex. And, it's a very complicated really region, but we need to really spend more time in looking at it systematically, theoretically, to disentangle those connections, rather than exclusively to work on describing the events that have happened. So one channel or one way that we think is important is to try to understand those governments. Why do they persist in rivalry? Keep in mind, those are hostile relations that persist over periods of time, which means that most of the time, less than that, there's probably going to be a change of really in government. More than one individual or leader or zaim that's going to come and go. So there's really something about those relationships that makes them persist. What is it? What drives those states to maintain, or the different really governments to maintain these relationships even when they come to power? What is it? And what is it that makes them take on such non-compromising positions? That is very important for future really directions in the MENA. And second, we want to listen to people, and that really mostly is my really approach. What do the empirics really tell us? Meaning my and my colleague, obviously, William Thompson. What do the streets really say about how they view others? Obviously, societies, we theorize, are very important processes and rivalries. Even if they don't get much attention in the discourse and the analysis of the Middle East and North Africa, they do confine governments in direct and indirect ways, in the ideas that they share, in the ways that they relay voice, in informal institutions. So how are societies involved in those rivalries? This is really, we think, something that needs to be really interrogated. How do societies really matter? And how do they get embroiled in such complex, really, relationships? Thank you very much. I hope that this really lays really the general, foundation of what we try to do in the project. I would be happy to talk about more cases, and I'm sure that my colleague Yahia Zoubir would have fascinating, really, explanations to share to us about really rivalries. Thank you very much.
جزيل الشكر عماد. انتقل للدكتور يحيى.
I would like to give the floor to Mr. Yahia Zoubir, so you can pose questions, and I would like also to remind our audience via Zoom, they can raise their hand via Zoom and pose questions as well. I have a number of questions, but I'm going to remain patient until we give the floor to Dr. Yahia Zoubir. Go ahead, Dr. Yahia Zoubir. دكتور بابا مش سامع مش سامعين مش مسموع
حطي هذا الثاني
contribution to the book. And I think that's where Imad picked me, because about 20 years ago I published an article on the rivalry, not using that term. I had used hegemony and counter-hegemony regarding Algeria, the relationship between Algeria and Morocco. It was more of an empirical study, although it had something about the, a nation building, why Morocco and Algeria were going in different directions, why they had tensions and so on and so forth. And then when I got involved in the project about 2 or 3 years or 4 years ago, when Imad and William Thompson invited me, I started giving it more thought, and especially the notion of shock. Because as you will see, I I identified the shocks. There were 2 listed in that graph that Imad posted. I'm going to add a third one, which is Trump's decision plus the defense, the military deal between Morocco and Israel. And that is going to be it is already the 3rd shock in those relations. In any case, but by being invited to deal with the rivalry and identifying the shocks, I have to be honest, I learned quite a bit myself, and I'm hoping that the readers will also learn, because there are so many variables. For instance, the construction of the image of the enemy, because that was the time when I think in a discussion with Imad, and I said it's an image, construction of the enemy, and then I got a little bit onto that very same path. But really, if I had to, what I learned from the shocks, it's not simply the shock, how it leads to the intensification of tensions between 2 states. I also found how the states can change direction because of the conflict of images or interpretations of what the other has done. I'll give you an example, because you look at and there are a lot of misconstructions and misperceptions from the outside. For instance, I came from a conference in Paris on Friday, in the Sorbonne, and I said, look, and it was about the conflict in Western Sahara, but more broadly about the relations in the region and all that. And I said, look, you guys, you talk a lot about whenever, especially in the media, when they talk about Algerian-Moroccan relations, the first thing they say, okay, it is because of Western Sahara and because Algeria supports Western Sahara. All right? And I said, wait a second. If you guys do an analysis, this rivalry and some enmity predates by far in history, the Western Sahara conflict, which is in 1975. So you saw on what Imad posted, you saw 1963. And I believe that 1963 was very important, even though the perceptions, misperceptions, antagonisms had begun before Algeria's independence during the 50s. And when Morocco became independent in 1956, and the way the nationalist movement in Algeria was going, versus what the Crown Prince Hassan II was looking at things. So it had a lot to do with nation state building, but also the border issue. There was a discussion about borders, and I'll be happy in the Q&A to get into more details. But just to put it in simple terms, the people tend to forget that Morocco invaded Algeria in 1963. That was the first shock. And in the chapter, I give a lengthy a quote from a very high official, retired, of course, Algerian official, and he basically explained how within the establishment, within the foreign service and so on, how people reacted to that war and what it did. And I think this is a dimension that, Imad, if we have to update the book, this is one dimension that we have to include, which is the divergent paths that the two countries took. Let me explain. Already you had a nationalist movement which had been developing with some ideas that some may characterize as radical, but which became the DNA, if you wish, of the Algerian foreign policy or of Algerian population in general, or the establishment in general. Support for national liberation movements, socialist ideas, and so on and so forth. And the other perception in Morocco, which was totally different. But what the first shock did, because Morocco, under Hassan II at the time, received support from mostly Western countries. And when Algeria had just come out of independence 1 year earlier, when Algeria asked for weaponry and so on, it was turned down. So Algeria turned to the Soviet Union at that time, and that's where it began. So I always say, if you do not understand that period, you will never understand what took place, in terms of the different foreign policies or the respective foreign policy of each state in the region. So you have two totally different perspectives. So it led Morocco to be very pro-Western. Up to today, it continues to be pro-Western, whereas Algeria had, in a sense, was building this state or its foreign policy based on true non-alignment, but more trusting of Russia and today China, because these are the two countries that had supported Algeria not only during the War of Independence, but also on the moral of independence, and it developed. Doesn't mean Algeria doesn't have good relations with the West, but it's different. It's a different type of relationship. It does have good economic relations with the United States, but politically they are at loggerheads, for instance. So that's how I started. And this is just to go back to the book and how, I started, I kept digging, and I know you're all anxious to hear about what's going on today. But to understand today, you need to go back to that very same period of where or when the image of the other was being constructed. And this is why even in the book, you will see in the theories about how you form the idea or the image of the other side, or even when one does something that seems very reasonable, the other one gives it a totally different interpretation. So to give you a broad idea, I would say that since there are a couple of exceptions, two periods in which Algerian and Moroccan relations were okay. This was more or less 1969 to 72, 73, the Treaty of Ifran, where there was a sort of willingness to cooperate and so on. And in 1989, 1991, when the Algerians and the Moroccans, had some agreements, which I will mention because one of the grievances, one of the reasons for the breakup by Algeria of diplomatic relations with Morocco had to do with, or at least it listed those grievances or those the agreements that they had entered in 1988 when they reestablished diplomatic relations, which incidentally had been broken by Morocco at the time. Morocco had broken diplomatic relations with Algeria in 1976, and they were not restored until 1988. And they were restored on some agreement. Of course, in the meantime, there was a war from 1975 until 91 between the Sahrawis, yes, supported by Algeria, and the Moroccan armed forces. But the reestablishment of diplomatic relations and the creation of the Arab Maghreb Union was founded on those some agreements, some accords, which the Algerians today accuse Morocco of not having honored. So that's one of the things. So basically, the argument I'm making is that we rarely had good relations between Algeria and Morocco, although in the last years it was a sort of cold peace, and especially in the last, I would say, in the last decade, where and I can explain it through some domestic issues in Algeria. I will come to that, but the relations were never really good. They were suspicions. And it was. I have to emphasize this point. It was mostly a rivalry between the two states. When I talk about the states, the state governments not reaching the people. And Imad, if you remember, in my conclusion, I had said I'm very afraid that because of the projection by the state using the media and so on and so forth, how they could create, animosity between the two people. And why do I say that? Because when you start researching Algerian Moroccan relations, you look first and you say, wait a second, let's look at this entity called the Maghreb. The Maghreb, there's a central Maghreb, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, and there is a Maghreb al-Akbar, which includes Libya and Mauritania, and so on. But if you take the central Maghreb, you cannot distinguish between an Algerian and a Tunisian, and an Algerian and a Moroccan. And all of them, the three. Same religion, same right, Maliki right. The dialect is the same. You could maybe say, oh, I think he's Maghrebi because of the accent, the lehja. But it's not so different from some Algerian who lives in the West. And in the East, it's about the same process between, the same observation when it comes to the Tunisians and the Algerians. But the question, of course, my research was, why two states so close could could reach such level of rivalry, such level of distrust. And I would argue that this has been painted, and I repeat this because I reject the interpretations by the media and by those who support one side or the other, in the sense that each state has painted the other before independence. The negative perceptions are the ones that led or have been building for all these years, and they produced the images that we have today at least between the Makhzen on the one hand in Morocco and the government in Algeria. As you can hear, like today when you see those tensions, one saying the archaic monarchy in Morocco, and the other one saying the regime of the corporals, نظام الكبرانات, as they say. But what is interesting in the study I conducted, and I had the real pleasure, and I thank Imad and William for having involved me in this, is to look at how over the years this has been constructed. If you look, I take a quick example, the second shock, which is the war in the Western Sahara. Of course, from the Algerian perspective, the Algerians they felt they had been had because Morocco, despite the decision of the International Court of Justice, but it conducted this Green March, and then it was betrayed by both Spain, Mauritania, and Spain, because they had a tripartite agreement at the expense of Algeria and so on and so forth. And from a Moroccan perspective, it was Algeria that had been preparing this. Forget about the international law or what the International Court of Justice had said. But somehow it was concocted by the Algerians that are the ones behind denying Morocco its recuperation of what it calls, its southern territories. And so on. So that's why it's interesting, because what we see in this beautiful book, I have to acknowledge that it's a beautiful book. But what I emphasized in mine was this interaction between history, national identity, in other words, the differentiation, how after 63, you can see the two states differentiating, I am this, and the altar is something else. It's the enemy. They never used the term enemy until a Moroccan consul in Oran had used the term al-adu. But before that they didn't. But it was le non-dit. It wasn't said, but it was there. You find issues of psychological motivations, state and nation building, border issues, attitudes towards the outside world, and ideological differences, of course, which have contributed to this strategic because it is a strategic, enduring rivalry. And the two shocks were only basically they were the impetus for the visibility, if you wish, of what has been going on for a long time. By the way, I didn't want to bore you, and today it's very interesting. The Algerians are reacting, and I'm looking at the Algerian perspective only today. I mean, for the moment, to give this example, because there were two things that happened at the same time in recent months or recent year. Not only the Trump, the Algerians discarded it, but the defense deal between Morocco and Israel. It confirmed some suspicions and so on. But also what Macron said about Algeria, which is because from the Algerian perspective, and it has some truth, of course, France is behind many of the things happening between Algeria and Morocco. And Macron had made a statement that Algeria before colonization was not a nation. And that is, I mean, it was horrifying to the Algerians. But today what you see is that many historians are showing how far back the Algerian nation has existed, which is, you know, and so there is sort of where the Algerians had no, for the Algerians, the most important issue worldwide, internationally, is the Palestinian question. Western Sahara was not a big question for the Algerians, but the Palestinian question. But this time, there is this sort of nationalist sentiment that is going at loggerheads with, you know, the Moroccans in general, because whoever says that there is no Algerian nation is triggering something that has been dormant, because in the Algerian DNA, there's always this notion of support for the right causes, for liberation movements, and so on and so forth. So what you have today, and this is the question that many people are asking me, why did Algeria this time break diplomatic relations? How much time do I have?
About 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, I can do it in 5 minutes. Today, I can give you some of the reasons why there's this breakup, and some may argue that it's really surprising that it didn't occur before. So, if you look at the last decade, and this is my argument, there was no Algerian diplomacy or real diplomacy. The president was a zombie, you know, and since he was always in control of foreign policy, so nothing was moving. In the meantime, Morocco had been making many steps to its to fulfill Morocco's own interests. For instance, rejoining or joining the African Union in 2017. And being really, in some ways, quite aggressive in undoing whatever gains Algeria had made before. And there was no reaction. There was really very little reaction in Algeria, you know, to these moves that Morocco was making. And so I would argue that it's not, and I repeat, and I know you're taping these things, it's not the normalization with Morocco that was the spark or the reason. It is one of the reasons, but not normalization as such, because from the Algerian perspective, you know, Israel-Morocco's relation, I mean, the relationship between Morocco and Israel has been there for a long time, and the Algerians are aware of it. But there were two things that I would, and that's why I talked about the notion of nation. One was Morocco's ambassador to the United Nations, Omar Hilal, at the non-aligned movement, circulating a letter and giving support to secessionist group. It's a small group. It's not an important one, but Morocco came out very openly to support that movement. And so the Algerians waited to see whether it was just the behavior of, and he's known, Omar Hilal is very anti-Algerian, almost critical of Algeria, putting down Algeria whenever he has a chance. So Algerians thought this was not the king's position. They waited, there was nothing. But then on 11th August, you had a meeting between Foreign Minister of Israel Lapid with Bourita, the Foreign Minister of Morocco, and the minister, the Lapid, basically threatens Algeria, or he says, we are concerned about Algeria's, behavior. It's opposing Israel's position as observer at the African Union and its relationship with Iran, which is, there's nothing particular about Algeria's relations with Iran. In fact, Algeria and Iran did not have diplomatic relations for quite some time, especially during the during the 90s. The Algerians had broken relations. So these two things resulted in the break of diplomatic relations. There were some other, I would say, details like the Pegasus story and so on. So there was something accumulating. And so and this is what is
Yahia,
interesting.
can you make this the last point, please, because we ran out of time officially.
Okay. All right. Okay, no problem. So what I'm saying now is that this is the third, if you wish, I think it's the third shock that I'm talking about, and it has all along there has never been I think anyone anticipating a real war between the two countries, but I think that we have a new element in the region, the presence of Israel, and it's not just Israel as a partner of Morocco in economics and so on, but in a military dimension, which makes the Algerians even more suspicious and creating this, intensifying this rivalry, which may result in different realignments, geopolitical realignments. I'm sorry if I took too long.
جزيل الشكر عماد ويحيى. الكثير من food for thought or maybe ammo for fire, we'll see. أنا يعني سأستغل منصبي سريعا وأسأل
ask two quick questions before I open the floor for your participation. My first question
العربية الأسباب والتحديات بموضوع المحاضرة، فهل في نتائج البحث وصلتم لنقل
regarding the continuation of conflicts and the rivalry between. There is the question of conflict supported by outside powers within the borders of one state. There are also conflicts without this kind of support. This is on the one hand. This is a question and a comment. The slide about Iran, unfortunately, it wasn't visible to all of you, that Iran now being at the center of a number of conflicts, wars and rivalries in the region. Is there any explanation? The revolutionary state of Iran, for example, France after the revolution, Cuba after the revolution, 1959, Fidel Castro said they tried to effect a regime change in all Latin American countries except for one in Mexico maybe. So maybe this is due to the revolutionary nature of a country trying to start revolutions everywhere. Is this applicable to Iran, China, wars in all directions, Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, India? في الحقيقة and also Yahya was the Algeria after the revolution, a republican regime which is more inclined towards the left vis-a-vis a regime which is more conservative. Of course, this was at the time when Nasser and the Egyptian revolution was there. Cuba was on its own, Iran was on its own in this particular model. These are my two questions. Abdul Karim, thank you, Dr. Omar. Thank you to both the presenters, Dr. Imad, Dr. Yahya. I have a question and a comment. At the conceptual level, you talked about shocks. You did not give any definition. Why we say shocks, we don't say war or crisis. Because shocks and wars are shocks and shocks are wars. So why is this different than the traditional tools we know in this kind of studies? The second question, why is the definition important? Because it will allow us to select what we can call a shock or not. Why should we consider 2003 a shock and not 2001? Wasn't Afghanistan the source of all these shocks? Was it a shock at the regional level or was it a shock at the global level? What do you mean by shock and how do we define shock? As for Dr. Yahya, I am happy to attend this session. At the beginning, I wanted a more balanced presentation. I didn't want to be a Moroccan defending the case of Morocco. I am a Moroccan after all and proud of it, but a selective selection of facts, this is what I'm talking about. Let's agree on this is a regional struggle and conflict, and the question of the Western Sahara is part of it. I think Morocco invaded Algeria in 1963. This is true, but that was preceded by the killing of 8 soldiers, Moroccan soldiers, in the desert. In 1975, there was no mention that 300,000 people or so were expelled out of Algeria. I condemn the statement by Omar Hilal, the Moroccan ambassador. Let's agree on that right from the outset. And also the Moroccan council in Wahran, I think this is nonsense. But what is more dangerous, a statement by a council in a city in Algeria like Wahran, or the chief of staff of the Algerian army, which is filmed, which available on video, where he describes Morocco as a traditional enemy. I did not want to get involved into this kind of I did not want a public speech presenting Algeria's point of view. I expected just us to stick to facts. Dr. Sid. Thank you, Dr. Omar. Can you hear me? First of all, I would like to congratulate Dr. Imad Mansour and Dr. Yahia for their wonderful book. I have a number of observations. First, pertaining to how suitable the theoretical framework regarding the situation, the bilateral situation between Morocco and Algeria, and secondly, a number of observations on the Dr. Yahya's presentation. Rivalries as part of the international relations and conflicts, it can be divided into three: military and perpetuated, and what Dr. Thompson, Imad and Yahya based their findings on three factors. First, they do not focus on the military action. Secondly, they focus on the perceptions of rivalry, on reciprocal animosities and mutual animosities, and this is what Dr. Yahya has based his analysis on when he alluded to the Moroccan-Algerian question. What we should focus on is knowing the root causes of conflict and war. And as was said by Dr. Imad, the basic idea here is that a number of 10 actors caused 49 conflicts in the last 3 centuries. What this means is that rivalry is a process which leads to a situation which is a conflict, war, shock, or crisis, or shock if we borrow Imad's terminology. As for the Moroccan-Algerian situation, we see the situation is the reverse, because rivalry emanated from the war of 1963, which was what ignited this whole crisis, and what was followed in the 70s of the border skirmishes and so on and so forth. Also, the date of what happened between 1963, the relations between Algeria and Morocco in the colonial period, it's true, it was like Dr. Zoubir we saw accusations of treason from Algeria against Morocco during the War of Liberation. But Dr. Yahya stresses that the second important event was events of 1975. Although there was a rivalry here, we see the rivalry is emanating from the state of conflict and not a cause for it, as is known in the theories or theorizations of conflict studies. This takes me to the call by Dr. Yahya to think in terms of counter factors. For example, if we suppose that the position taken by Algeria in 1975, would it have been the same position if the war of 1963, the war of sand, did not take place? This, I think, is an important point we should pause and contemplate. Another point, Dr. Yahya used the framework of strategic rivalry in his analysis, despite that he based his analysis or explanation almost entirely on the dynamism or dynamics of the security dilemma. I personally did not find any evidence for the presence of this security dilemma. The facts and figures do not support that in the last 50 years. The deals that Morocco concluded, or the Algerians concluded, the reactions were always rhetorical. There was no arms purchases from both sides. In addition to that, the logic of the security dilemma shows that there is no what we call the third action, which is arming myself for fear of my first move that was directed against him, then his second action was directed at me, and my third direction will be against him. And also, there was no explanation that the analysis led to me reducing my security as a result. This is what's known as the security dilemma. This kind of behavior is not present in the workings of the rivalry between Algeria and Morocco, so this really undermines the analysis. And many analysts in strategic studies, unfortunately, are dragged into this kind of analysis. Another point regarding statements, I commend what Dr. Yahia has done in his presentation. He used many interviews with personalities, statements from within the regime, and this makes me wonder, first of all, how we can overcome the bias in these statements, because most of these statements are derived from Algerian sources. Thank you, Dr. Seed. I will come back to you again. I'll come to the presenter. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Zoubir and Dr. Imad for the book. Unfortunately, I haven't had the opportunity to read it, so therefore I cannot discuss the book even at the theoretical level, because I'm not familiar with the ins and outs of the situation. I just want to mention, however, an important point, and I'll avoid the term rivalry, because rivalry does not explain the depth of the conflict between Algeria and Morocco. And this is, in essence, a Moroccan narrative against an Algerian narrative. So therefore, it's a conflict of narratives. And what Dr. Zoubir described as enmity, this is the essence of the problem. From a Moroccan point of view and the Algerian point of view, the other is an enemy, at least at the level of the elite discourse. This narrative of stabbing in the back or treason or whatever has led to the policy in Morocco from an idealist one into a pragmatic one after 1963. Now I am building on what Dr. Zoubir has said, adding to that the Moroccan narrative. When it takes us back to 1840 or the middle of the 19th century, when Amir Abdel Qadir, the leader of resistance, escaped from Algeria and calling the assistance of Sultan Abdel Rahman of Morocco. Sultan Abdel Rahman responded to him and entered a war with France in support of the Algerian resistance. Morocco lost in this war, and Wajda and Tanja and other cities were bombarded, and 1840 was a pivotal year. Why? Because its consequences for the Moroccan territory was dire. Morocco was dwarfed after that, after the Mernia Agreement, and France went even further in this policy to 1952. 1952, as we all know very well, France took off Tintouf and Bashar to include that to its colony of Algeria because France had no intention of leaving Algeria. In 1952 was another turning point in the history of the conflict between Morocco and Algeria. From a Moroccan point of view and a Moroccan narrative's point of view, Morocco and in its calls for reclaiming Tindouf and Bashar, France responded that, which said that France was ready to return Bashar and Tindouf in return for dismantling a base which Morocco was allowing for the Algerian resistance. Muhammad al-Khamis, the Moroccan king of the time, rejected that, saying that this is a territorial issue. We will postpone and we will deal and raise with the Algerian brothers after they gain their independence. This was the idealistic position. In 1963, when Hassan II was enthroned, he signed an agreement with Abbas Farhat, a document which recognizes the presence of a territorial issue which was caused by the colonial power France, and this will be raised after Algeria's independence. After Algeria's independence in the 60s, Hassan II called for the restoration of Bashar and Tindouf to Moroccan territory, and the response from Algeria was to keep the colonial borders in response to the African Union organization's position. Of course, in the days of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, now I am referring to the Moroccan narrative. At the time of the Sand War, Morocco was facing an existential problem. First, there was the Independence Party, which had a very strong popular roots and grassroots, and also was trying to restore the territories taken by both Spain and France as colonial powers, and also the monarchy was subjected before to some threats by the Saddam Hussein regime. In 1963, the Moroccan Mullah Abdul Rahman and Mohammed bin Yusuf's policy was replaced by a policy of supporting the neighbors, because it was discovered that this idealistic position was not good, is not in favor, was not to the advantage of Morocco. Muhammad al-Khamis changed that policy into a more pragmatic one, and the Moroccan regime started identifying Algeria as an enemy, and Morocco approached its relations with Israel, and Israel was supporting the Moroccan the Moroccan monarchy, and it was an attempt to gain America's support in the Cold War. I'll leave it here. I wanted to just to complete the Moroccan narrative to counteract the Algerian narrative. I do not fully support it, but just to balance things out. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for both the historical and the narrative and the theoretical.
Okay. But regarding the population of the Moroccans in Algeria that had been expelled from Algeria, and I denounced that in my first article on Algerian-Moroccan relations. I said it affected people who had been living there for a long time. I was critical of the government. The second one who is accusing me because I interviewed a retired official that somehow it makes me biased. I was talking about the narratives, and I did say from the Algerian government's perspective, from the policy makers, it's not what I am saying. Because when you look at this rivalry, you look in what the lady said. I'm not against or for. I'm talking about narratives. In the chapter, which is, I don't know, 40 pages long, I tried to give the two sides, how they perceive one another and what led to it. So 1963, yes, the lady is right, and I mentioned it in the chapter, there was a talk between Farhat Abbas and the king, Mohammed V, although France was pushing Morocco to have some deals, and the king, Mohammed V, was courageous and said, no, I am not going to do this while Algeria is at war. I will discuss it with the Algerians after the war. But in the meantime, he passed away. So it was with Hassan II that the discussions were held, and then you have a new regime, not new regime, but the Algerians responded by we irrigated the land with the blood of 1.5 million martyrs. We're not going to give an inch of our territory, and whatever it was. But I think the good question that was asked was by Omar regarding the domestic issues. In '63, both regimes were faced with domestic problems, just like in '75. '75 was more on the Moroccan side, and we can discuss it with the Moroccan colleagues here. '63, Bambarka was attracted by the Republican perspectives and the socialist perspective in Algeria. So that was not, of course, acceptable to Hassan II. In Algeria, there was an uprising. There was a sort of rebellion or break within the elite, which wanted a different perspective as to the construction of the state. So there was opposition to the regime. So that is also in the chapter. Both were. But what I was trying to do, and I would take your criticisms. This is what scholarship is all about. I was not presenting Algeria from my perspective as being, here is Algeria is right. Is to present the narratives of both sides. That's basically what my point was. And I can assure you, whether you believe me or not, both sides, I mean, I get some in terms of interviews. No one wants to talk it's a part of the region where they do not talk to researchers. I found someone who had been involved, who was present in some debates, an old retired official who I interviewed. The others don't. For the Moroccans, I took Moroccan colleagues who had published on the issues, and they are copiously cited in the article, in the chapter, if you dare to read it. So I was not exposing a pro-Algerian or pro-something else position. I was just saying, what is it that triggered? Yes, and in the chapter, I would say, here is what the perspective was from the Moroccan side. But up to today, why 63 was more important from an Algerian perspective is that move towards the Soviet Union at the time, at least as far as military relations and political relations were concerned. Yes, and the lady very accurately said that Algeria in 63, Algeria got support from Egypt, from Cuba. That was a normal thing. And Morocco got it from France and the United States. There is a white paper. The United States supported the Moroccans, and France was behind it, just like in 75. And I'm not making value judgment. I'm just saying a reality that the two chose different paths, and the two contradictory paths lead to or aggravate the rivalry. That's what I was saying. So any other interpretation, it engages only your person, but that's not what I was trying to do. If I did not do it right, I apologize for it. But that was not my intention. You just read the chapter, and then you will see that this was not. I tried to give as accurate I cite the journalist of the map who was based in Algeria a lot. He was very critical, and I cite him throughout because he gave a good. For me, it was a very learning experience to read about how it was being perceived from the Moroccan side. That's all there was. There are two sides. There was not one. I did not say Algeria is right, Morocco is wrong. I'm just saying how they each perceive the other. That's what
شكرا يحيى، شكرا للتوضيح. وانتقل إلى عماد.
Very much for the clarification. I would like to move now to Imad. Thank you very much for the question.
سؤال حول نتائج البحث عمر الصراعات والاختلاف داخل الدولة وتنافس ما بين الدول معا. هذا موضوع.
So this is going to be the title of the coming book that is going to be authored by Bill and myself. The short answer is that there is no inclination for war in the two regions, or in the region in particular. And we have seen the rise of the Cold War, and this has led to certain transformations in relation to the different countries. So wars have moved from traditional wars to competition between countries, alternative kinds of wars between countries. Competition at the military level without having any direct confrontation. Yes, there are manifestations of such kind of two phenomena. So talking about Iran as an axis of competition, the Iranian revolution was one of the main reasons, but Iran in 1979 is not Iran today, is not Iran in 2005. So Iran stood against intervention by the US in the region and against the alliances that have been concluded between countries in the region and the US, because this has led to the fact that Iran felt under pressure from a technical perspective. In 1975, Syria was a center of so many competitions with Turkey, with Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt, and with Israel as well. So if we move to the year 2000, as we can see before us, Iran has become a center of power. So the foreign policy of Iran has impacted the different alliances and the relationship with the non-state actors, and also the intervention of the US, countries such as China and Russia. So the level of competition between Iran and these countries has become very important. So is it because of the revolutionary reasons? Perhaps if the regional context is different, perhaps there's going to be a different explanation to that. Why the other question that talked about shocks and not crises. So the definition of war is very clear, the definition of crisis is very clear, but when it comes to shocks, we attempt to say that this is not a concept, a clear concept. So at the beginning of the book, we perhaps started with a traditional crisis or a war that has changed the status quo and forced the decision makers to deal with this reality in a certain way in order to change the resources of the state. But what these regions faced is a new phenomenon that has led the decision makers to deal with this new phenomenon. A crisis is clear, a war is clear, but when it comes to shock, it is different altogether. A shock is a shock. It changes the status quo. So after this book, we try to write a research paper to set the theoretical background of a shock, but we failed. So Michael Breacher talked about a sudden change and described it as a shock, and he gauged it based on an analogy which is tremors. So he compared between tremors and shocks because it is a kind of a sudden change or transformation. So we tried to come up with a detailed explanation or definition of a shock. But if we go into the empirical dimension from the perspective of researchers who know these cases, how did they understand shock? What has happened in the region and that has led to this direct impact? Can we talk really about the shock of 2003, which is the American invasion of Iraq? Can we talk about another shock? It is up to empirical investigators. Do we have a problem when it comes to finding a definition to shock? Yes, we do have such a difficulty, but we know it is important. That is why we need to have further research in this regard. So we're talking about a certain kind of timeline within a certain crisis or within a certain war that leads to a change in the behavior of a state or the behavior of a regional system. Yes, it's what leads to a change in behavior. The decision makers realize that the status quo should be changed. Perhaps the change might not be at the level of the behavior, perhaps at the level of intellect or policy, but not necessarily leading to a change. Any questions? Any comments? Mr. Abdel Karim? So even if we disagreed, it doesn't mean that this is going to impact us on a personal level. No, this is just part of the discussion of the different accounts or narratives. So this is the end of shock or competition. I would like to add something. I hope that the intervention of my colleague Yahia, I hope that this is going to be a prelude to so many researchers to talk and to read about competition, shock, and Yahia, perhaps we're going to have another book about competition in this region. If there are no more questions or interventions or any other comments, here I would like to extend my thanks once again to Dr. Imad Mansour and Dr. Yahia Zoubir, and I would like also to thank my colleagues at the Strategic Studies Unit, and also I'd like to thank my colleagues at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. We have come to the end of this session.